Hi, we come to the end of the Abraham story with a surprising postscript, which most scholars would agree comes from some other source, and I'm not going to worry that here any more than I worried it throughout the rest of the Abraham story we've been looking at. But it offers a surprise twist to the story as we see it here, as well as a couple of conclusions. So as we enter into this passage, we're not going to look at too many of the details because a lot of it are names that don't really matter. They're not mentioned anywhere else and we know nothing about them. But as you can see on the right side of the screen, it's divided clearly into two separate blocks with the center piece there, although it's not a chiastic shape, the blessing and settling of Isaac, perhaps surprisingly, as we'll see at Bir Lahai Roi, which is associated with Ishmael. So in the first part, we can see this new marriage and children. We thought Abraham was too old to have Isaac many years ago. Isaac, who's now 40, and now he's got another wife and a whole bunch more children. So Abraham's fertility just keeps on going. But what's important here is not so much that he still has more fertility, but how he treats these people in relation to Isaac, as we'll see. Also, how the narrator, or the authors, whoever you want to think of that there, treat Ishmael very positively at the end of this. And as we'll see at the end of our scene, Ishmael and Isaac come together to bury their father, perhaps because they were living in the same vicinity, if not actually living together. So not a lot of images of this. The one image I could find of Keturah is from Dikla Lauer, whose work I've been showing before, and this beautiful image of her. And I like the fact that it's showing her kind of alone, because even though we're going to hear of this multitude of children and grandchildren and even a great-grandchild, she's pretty alone in the text. She has no voice and no anything other than that she was a womb that bore these children. So let's begin to look at our story as we have it. So Abraham took another wife, and here literally it's another woman, an Isha, and that's important because at the end of our scene here, she'll be described differently, as we'll see, or maybe somebody else is being described differently. So he took another woman whose name was Keturah, which can mean something like incense, as you can see in my note down below, similar to the Hebrew katar, to burn as incense. But as my note down below notes, in some of the Midrash, she's identical to Hagar, having a name change. And what the Midrash comments on is that Abraham has come back to her after Sarah. So that's an interesting piece of that as well. As Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg comments on the Midrash, in an obvious symbolic reversal, Abraham reaffirms his life urge to integrate and to include. So we hear the names of all these people. Midian is the only one that has any specific reference elsewhere as traders in the Joseph story, and it'll be important there. But probably the author of Genesis 25 doesn't know the Joseph story. There's certainly nothing to suggest that. But notice that we also get the next generation here. Joksan is the first generation, and we get his son Dedan, and then their sons, and then the sons of Midian here. The only name that is otherwise relevant is Hanok, which is the same as Enoch, connecting back to Cain's son earlier, and there's also another Enoch in the Table of Nations that we saw earlier as well. But there's no particular reference. It certainly seems to be a common name. And notice it's framing, these were the children of Keturah. It doesn't say the children of Abraham and Keturah, simply the children of Keturah, and that's all we hear about her. But what's important now is to see, as my chart on the right says, what happens here. So it says Abraham gave all he had to Isaac. There's some interesting questions here. What does he have? We saw how much silver he spent on the burial place, which will be mentioned here. He obviously has animals, and he has at least one servant, perhaps more. Does he give all those to Isaac? Is Abraham even in relationship with Isaac? Does he even know where he lives? As we saw after the binding story at the end of chapter 22, they apparently were in no relationship together, and Isaac settled away from his father. So how Abraham gave all he had to Isaac is left open by the text. But in verse 6, its situation really changes, and that's what leads many scholars to suggest that we have in verse 5 and 6 is from a different source, a different author, and it may be, but we have it the way we have it, so that's how we have to read it. So he says, to the sons of his concubines, using the word here, Pilagesh, which is only used one other time. We can look at it back there to see the context in 22:24. This is referring to Abraham's brother who had this concubine who bore these other children. Pilagesh is a word referring usually to a secondary wife, but Keturah, like Hagar, is simply referred to as an Isha. So is this summarizing the idea that Hagar and Keturah fall into this category of Pilagesh, which they weren't named elsewhere? Or is this somebody else, or is just simply from a different tradition? Certainly within the narrative context we're reading in here would seem to apply to the children of Keturah, and the main point being that he gave Isaac all that he had, but using an unusual word here, matanoth, only here in Genesis and a few other times, but not a normal word for gift, and certainly not what we're going to see in the Jacob story for what Jacob tries to give to Esau at the end of that story. So giving them something while he was still alive, and then he sent them away from his son Isaac, underscoring this eastward to the east country, Kedma el Eretz Kadem. Wenham suggested Kedem as a proper noun, as suggested in Numbers, and we don't need to worry about whether it's a place called East or simply the East Country. But as we've been seeing, that's back to the Old Country, although it will come up in the Jacob cycle because that's exactly where Rebekah will send her son Jacob back to her brother Laban to find a wife, as well as for some other purposes we'll get to there. The point simply being here that he sent them away back to the Old Country, and it's an interesting thing because we're going to see that the children of Ishmael are down the coast, down this way. So where exactly to the east country these other children, if they're the children of Keturah, isn't made clear. And then we get to the summary of Abraham's life, and it's described numerically and then in images that suggest the absolute fullness of life. So these are the days of Abraham's life, 175 years. I'm not going to click on that right here because there's a little answer to a number puzzle in my note, but I just want to suggest, and you can think about it if you like, Abraham lived to be 175, Isaac lives to be 180, and Jacob lives to be 147. If this was an SAT question, what would be the next number in the sequence? 175, 180, and 147. Of course, you can look it up on the internet and figure it out for yourself as well. Something important is being said there, but I'm going to save that for another time. And then we hear this extravagant expression, Abraham breathed his last and died a good old age, as predicted in 1515, as we saw. And that would be enough, but it goes on, an old man and full of years. So he had all the length of his days as an old man and full of years, literally old and satiated here, as also described for Isaac, but not of Jacob, who complains before Pharaoh that his days have been few and his life difficult, and was gathered to his people. And as my note below says, contrary to many interpretations that this is simply a metaphor for death or burial, which are both named separately, Sarna argues for it referring to a belief in some kind of afterlife, although that's very vague, which is to say gathered to his ancestors, although there's nothing more to be said about that other than the fact that we're going to see it again in just a few verses, showing the parallel between Abraham's death and, interestingly, with Ishmael's death. So now we hear of what may be perhaps a surprise, paralleling what we'll see in 35:29 for Jacob and Esau burying Isaac. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah. And notice how it's described in this specific way in all this detail, as it always is. It could simply just say the cave of Machpelah, and for this purpose that would seem all that's necessary. But it highlights where it came from. And notice it doesn't say the field of Abraham. It still says the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, that Abraham purchased. But it's suggesting it's still Ephron's field here. And the word for purchase here, kana, is not the same language we saw in chapter 13, but for Eve's acquisition of a man back in chapter 4. And God is creator in other places. So literally, Abraham acquired from the Hittites. It doesn't suggest the money transaction here, as we saw in detail in chapter 23. But plainly, it's the cave of couples, as Machpelah said, doubled cave or cave of couples, and now Abraham and his wife Sarah are a couple in death. We don't know how they ended their life in terms of their relationship, but now they're together in death. And so now we get to the absolute center of our passage without a lot of details. And my note below notes, does this imply continued blessing or the beginning of blessing with God blessing his son Isaac? Notice it's Elohim here. It's not Yahweh in this point. So after the death of Abraham, and that phrase is used nowhere else in the Pentateuch, but notice it starts at the beginning of Joshua. We can look at one there, after the death of Moses. So it becomes a standard transition that we see in a number of places in 2 Samuel after the death of Saul. As Sarna notes, in each instance it indicates that a historical turning point has been reached, an era has come to an end, but the continuity of leadership has been assured. And so that's what we're seeing here, that the blessing promised to Abraham will now be continued across the line to Isaac. And I really want to underscores something here of who's doing the blessing. It's God blessing the son Isaac. Because as we're going to see momentarily with around the birthright and blessing story later in this very chapter 25 in Genesis and then in chapter 27, there's going to be much energy in the story and much energy from commentators on the fatherly blessing and Isaac giving a blessing to Jacob and or Esau. But I want to highlight here, the narrator's highlighting the direct blessing from God. And we're going to have to raise the question of, is a human quote-unquote blessing any more powerful than simply a wish, as opposed to God's blessing, which actually has power? So that's what we're hearing here, is that God blessed Abraham's son Isaac, presumably with the same blessing to continue the promises of land and progeny, etc. So Isaac settled at Beer Lahai Roi. And if we look back, we can see exactly the well called Beer Lahai Roi where Hagar was. And the very next verse reminding us that she bore Abram a son. And of course that son was Ishmael. So Isaac is clearly settling at the place associated with his brother or half-brother Ishmael, which leads the narrator to go directly to the question of Ishmael. And you'll note here that this sequence is fulfilling a couple of things. We see it in 1720, and we can go there. As for Ishmael, and this is to Abraham now, I've heard you, I will bless him and make him fruitful and exceedingly numerous. He shall be the father of 12 princes. We'll look at the word for princes in a moment. And I will make him a great nation. And that's exactly what we see here. That they've become 12 princes and he's become a great nation. So the fulfillment of the promise to Ishmael. So any readers who might be settling with, on Sarah's side, that my son shall not inherit with the son of that slave woman, certainly it's not suggesting here that Abraham gives anything directly to Ishmael, but God does. And that he's very successful. We see all the children and their success, and his death will echo that of his father Abraham in terms of a fullness. So we can't judge Ishmael based on Sarah. We have to judge Ishmael based on God, and God sides with Ishmael here. So notice again the whole summary, just like we saw of the land. The descendants of Ishmael, or Toledot, as we've been seeing earlier, and we'll see again. Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's slave girl, bore to Abraham, highlighting that just as we've seen the details here about Abraham's death. So she's still named as Hagar the Egyptian, which of course wouldn't change, but as Sarah's slave girl here, rather than as Abraham's wife, which is in effect what she was as well. And now we get the names of the sons of Ishmael here, and notice we don't get a wife here. We heard it earlier, but we don't get any sense of a wife here, just of these children, named in the order of their birth. And we don't need to look at the details of all these names, even though I have a couple of notes, because they're not particularly relevant. And notice it's not exactly chiastic, but it's framed here by the names of the sons of Ishmael. And these by their names here, and by their villages, which is an unusual word here. It's Van Cedars quoting at Westerman notes the Mari term for nomadic settlement. And there's two words in this that suggest an Arabian or otherwise nomadic languages here, as opposed to the sense of urban languages. And by their encampments here. A camp protected by a stone wall, as in Numbers. But the phrase for princes here is Nesaim. It's different than Nagid, which is used in the Deuteronomistic history, regularly translated as prince, as a political leader. It's also in certain messianic prophecies, as in Micah, for the one that God would provide. So not as a melech, as a king, but as a Nagid, as some kind of political leader. This is more like a community leader or a tribal leader, as it's named here. And it's used only twice earlier. Notice in the connection with the purchase of the land that we saw back there, where the Hittites described Abraham as one of those people. So again, not prince in the way you think of it in European history as the son of the king, or even royalty in any sense, but simply as a powerful leader in the community, as a member of some tribe. And we'll see it in chapter 34 here, around here where it is the son of the leader of the local city. That's unusual. And notice it's describing 12 according to their tribes, again using an unusual word. The word for Israelite tribes is Shevet here, but this is Ummah, and only two other places. And again, Westerman notes indicating Arabian influence. But noticing that it's naming right here that Ishmael is the father of 12 tribes. And we're going to hear that Jacob has 12 sons, but they're not going to be described as 12 tribes within this context. We have to look outside of Genesis to see the sons of Israel Israel as the eponymous names of the tribal members. So we hear the final conclusion of Ishmael's life, which leads to a curious footnote here, but we'll get to there in a second. This is the length of Ishmael, 137 years, unlike the 175 of Abraham, which has an interesting multiple pattern. This is a prime number, as with Sarah's 127. And notice the similarity to the death of Abraham we just saw. He breathed his last and died. Notice not full of days and years, even though he's 137, to all accounts, that's pretty full. So we don't hear that fullness and satisfaction, but certainly also the gathered to his people, but pointedly not in the cave of Machpelah here. That's not his fate. But then, interestingly, they settled. So after the death of Ishmael, which is why this is in parentheses, to suggest that verse 18 follows from verse 16, and verse 17 is interpolation here, and some parentheses, and that may well be, because plainly Ishmael isn't settling after he's died. So the sons of Ishmael are described here as settling here. From Havilah to Shur. And if we look at the map, although Havilah isn't here, we can see Shur here. Here's where Isaac was in Beer Lahai Roi, and again also associated with Ishmael. And so Ishmael's people are down this direction, described as opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria here, which is plainly just wrong. Assyria is the exact opposite direction. I don't know how the New RSV translators could render it there. Now, the word is Ashura, but as Sarna notes, it cannot be Assyria, but rather some place in the northern Sinai Desert, if it's not a variant of Shur itself. The phrase is an interesting one, though. From Havilah to Shur has a couple of interesting echoes. Here in 1 Samuel 15:7, we saw Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt, just before the scene of Samuel challenging him for not completing the job. So that's an interesting echo there. Are we supposed to hear Ishmael as somehow related to Saul? That seems a little obscure. What's more likely is this is just a figure of speech for referring to this land here that's south and along the shore on the way to Egypt from the land that becomes Israel. And so as we reach the end, I could have stopped at verse 18 because most scholars have suggested the Jacob story starts with verse 19, but I wanted to highlight at least the transitional elements we see here, because the Toledot of Isaac here in verse 19 certainly matches the Toledot of Ishmael we saw back in verse 12 and framing this subsection. What's important is how it's different. The Toledot of Isaac, Abraham's son, notice not mentioning of Sarah here again, and again twice. Abraham was the father of Isaac twice. And as Sarna notes, hardly needed after the foregoing, a literary device for emphasizing Isaac's role as the sole successor to the patriarch in fulfillment of the promise. And Anderson notes how the repetition, quote, foreshadows the continuity with the promises to Abraham that will be so central to the story of Jacob, as we'll see in a moment. And so then we're told for the second time that Isaac was 40 years old, as we heard earlier, when he married Rebekah, which we heard at the end of chapter 24, of course. But then we hear this, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram. And this is the first time we're hearing Aramean. And notice it's twice, for Bethuel, the grandmother here, and for Laban, the brother of Rebekah. And that will be very important. This is foreshadowing what's going to happen in the Jacob story, just as we saw Rebekah mentioned back in chapter 11, foreshadowing her presence in the story later. So the transition here from the death of Abraham and the death of Isaac to the Toledot of Isaac, which doesn't have children right away because his wife is barren, and that will lead us directly into the Jacob story. So that's where we'll go next time, and I'm going to do an introduction to the Jacob story because the Jacob story is so complicated and so fascinating and so funny and ironic and all kinds of other humorous ways that we need to get oriented before we dig into it. So we'll see you for that next time. Bye-bye.